Hey, how's it going? And welcome back to the show where I have a random opinion and hopefully you care about it. And today's topic is going to be the third class. Now, if you don't know the third class, well, they're actually the people who fall under the level of victimhood that's actually under you if you're middle class, aka the people who usually keep complaining. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Now, this isn't scripted, so I'm probably gonna do a lot of gas, probably gonna fucking burp and shit in the middle. That's pretty epic, but I wanted to talk about the third class. Now, there's a lot of contempt for the middle class from the elites. That's what they tell you. Well, how about the third class? Well, how much do people hate homeless people? Well, the anti-homeless infrastructure that we put in place to prevent them from sleeping in nice places, that actually costs more than it was to house them. That's how much they hate homeless people. So, in the lines of priorities, who's the bigger victim? I would say the third class is definitely a bigger victim than the second. They don't really tend to complain as much, though maybe we should learn something from that. But in terms of fair share, which is the whole premise of taxes, maximizing the well-being of those most in need before the well-being of those who already have more than enough money to pay for their own well-being. That's the premise of taxes, paying their fair share. Now, there's a big difference between communism, paying all of the taxes, and say socialism. Socialism is in between. It's a balance between just prioritizing entirely just the well-being of the people, maximizing that well-being over property rights, say taxes, because those are your property, otherwise it can be taken from you. So socialism is the idea of giving you a fair share. Now, I would agree it's mostly reasonable unless, if you take away the fact that no amount of theft is reasonable, at least in my opinion, the whole premise of maximizing well-being over property rights, you take taxes, for example, 30%. Now, nobody would go completely bankrupt from not paying their taxes. There's some gay noise in the background. I'm sorry about that. But the whole premise behind taxes is that it won't completely destroy your standard of living for you to pay your taxes, and it'll only be a minor inconvenience at best for the people who pay them, while not receiving the public services that might be paid with those taxes would be a major inconvenience for those who couldn't benefit from it. So, say the classes which are below, for example, paying your fair share. If Jeff Bezos had to pay his 30%, he wouldn't be drinking out of the sewer because his waters wouldn't work. That's just not how it happens. So, in terms of that, paying taxes definitely won't make anybody go bankrupt. It's not going to destroy anyone's life. But based on that premise, which I think that's completely fair, if you don't, if Jeff Bezos had to pay his taxes, he wouldn't go bankrupt. But if you're the average middle class person who ends up being unfortunate and say getting cancer, for example, well, overnight, due to being unfortunate, you could just go financially bankrupt because American healthcare is just not affordable for the middle class. In fact, it's well known since I'm from France and my mother's actually a French immersion teacher in that community. It's well known since these people often come from France or Belgium, which is a first world country where healthcare not only exists but works. By the way, just thought I would mention that. Well, in that system, most people, they sort of know in our community, in the French teacher community, I'm not a part of that, but we sort of all know that if we get a deadly disease, say cancer, we go back to France or to our home country, and we just take the ticket. It's the plane ticket, $2,000 to $3,000 at least. I'm not really sure because I travel with my mother. We combine the cost. At least $1,000 there, at least $1,000 back, and that's way less expensive to just go back home and get treated. So, by those standards, I would agree that the premise of socialism, if we actually had free healthcare in this country, that would at least be a good idea in theory. Now, there's, of course, a balance between property rights, say taxes, and maximizing the overall well-being. But the thing is, people are very inconsistent with that because your fair share, paying your fair share to the middle class, say if your first class is no different, as I mentioned in a previous video, than the middle class paying their fair share to the third. Now, there's a big problem with this, and it's that most middle class people, including me, by the way, actually have a house, and most of us have a house that could fit more than just one person or the people you live with. You could probably house a homeless person. Say, if you have a storage room, I have a storage room. Now, this isn't my house. I can't use it to house a homeless person. My mother actually uses that space. But wouldn't it be a fair thing to ask of the middle class, the average middle class person, at least upper middle class, who, say, has a storage room? Wouldn't it be fair to demand of them that they house the homeless, since obviously the first class is even more entitled and they aren't going to do it? Obviously, the government isn't about to end homelessness anytime soon, but the middle class could actually take that upon their shoulders. Middle class make up the bulk of the population, and there are way more than enough of them with at least one extra storage room to be able to house a homeless person. Now, I would say that is only a minor inconvenience for you. Just house them, maybe even feed them. How much does that cost? That's definitely much better than, say, getting another child if you're super poor. A lot of poor people do that. Clearly, they can afford it. Well, just housing a homeless person, if you have an extra storage room, would just cost you not using that storage room for whatever else, and maybe feeding them. That'd be only a minor inconvenience to you. It would definitely not plummet your standard of living. Meanwhile, the homeless person you would be housing, the benefit you would offer to them, they would be majorly inconvenienced from having to sleep outside in the streets and probably freeze to death during the winter, versus getting to be housed and even fed by the average middle class person who can afford it. Usually they just have kids instead. So I think that's definitely a fair share that you can demand of the middle class to the third class. If you have at least one extra storage room, just house the homeless. Since the government isn't going to, how about you do it? I think that's a fair share. Now, the reason why we wouldn't have that is because middle class are the victims. They don't owe anything to anyone because they're the only ones who are supposed to be represented by the government. That's at least what they tell you a lot of the time. Well, there's also the issue, and I'm entirely against money in politics. I think it's bribery, but people will also, a lot of the time, the middle class have a big problem with money in politics. And I I absolutely agree with that, but one thing that is very interesting to point out is, what would that be? Well, it sort of creates a hierarchy of how important your speech is. A lot of the time, and I agree with this analogy, people will say, yeah, being able to have campaign donations, infinite amount of campaign donations during election times, that is sort of like a megaphone that drowns out all other speech. And that sort of puts your speech as a first class person in priority over everybody else's. It sort of gives you more power that you shouldn't necessarily have. Now, I would say, how about the third class? You don't hear them speaking ever because homeless people can't afford food. They probably can't afford a phone and internet. How they pay for that? But they should have a right to free speech. After all, they probably have more to say than anyone. They're more oppressed than anybody, and they're the ones who never talk to you about it. They're not entitled enough to do so. They have better things to do than go look for the one who's oppressing them. Well, maybe they should get some free speech. How about if the average middle class person committed to just coming together and paying for every homeless person to have a phone? Now, there are way less homeless people than, say, people in a community who see them every day while going to the drive-thru, for example, in a restaurant, such as McDonald's. It's like there are way many more people who are middle class surrounding the average homeless person than the homeless people make up in terms of quantity. So you could definitely say, well, if you're against the first class having this advanced version of speech, having a more powerful version of speech than you do, well, again, the third class has no speech. A lot of the time, they don't have a phone. How about, for the premise of free speech, you just go ahead and pay a homeless person a phone? Now, I would never demand any of that. In fact, I wouldn't demand any of what I have mentioned in this video, because I believe that your property is your rights, and if you want to be an asshole, you should have every right to do so. That's why I don't have a problem with people going with tax loopholes. In fact, I don't blame them at all, because the majority of what the US dollar is being used for, the majority of what your stolen taxpayer money is being used for, is going towards a giant scam called the US military, funding hypothetical foreign threats, such as all the countries that might want to attack the world's biggest nuclear arsenal, for instance, versus the actual measurable, like concrete threat, such as not having free healthcare that is domestic, that is actually happening inside the country, that is absolutely measurable, and you can measure the amount of people who are dying from it. It's a joke. And in fact, these people care so little about you. If you're the average citizen of the United States, these people who are, well, the military, isn't the whole concept behind it supposed to be these people care so much about their citizens that they're willing to die for their citizens. They want to fight and die for them. Well, how about their leaders? Well, how are the military leaders like? Well, Secular Talk just released a video, apparently over $1 trillion in Pentagon money missing. Well, what does that mean? That means that they cared so little about your stolen taxpayer money that they didn't even bother accounting and tracking where it was going. They didn't even bother doing that. That's how much they care about you. So, of course, I don't blame anybody for going through tax loopholes, even more since this stolen money is not only being stolen, but it's also being wasted. But if you have a problem with taxes because you think the first class should pay their fair share to the second, how about, again, you start looking down and realizing that, well, if you're middle class, probably you are, in case you're actually complaining about things, well, you could probably do what you're asking of those who you're mad at. You could probably do the same thing yourself and be a bit more consistent.